welcome, Jas. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing all this with us. I wanted to start with one question that I think unites all of us here on this call. Why smell?
I think everyone's gotten that question probably like every other day in their work. It's always an interesting question. I think for me, what brings me back to smell on a personal level is just how evocative a sensory experience smell is. It's something that can, in a half second, just transport you in time or in location or change your outlook on the situation completely, whether that's like how you prefer something like the valence or like disgust or things like that. It's very strong as an experience, and it's quite surprising that it's not, I guess, at least not discussed as much in society, in at least American society, right? So that's what essentially drawed me to smell to start with, and then has continued bringing me back towards the sensory modality, both for artworks, for research purposes, and so forth. And we still don't know what we can use this modality for specifically, which makes it such a right place for academic research as well. Yeah,
that's so true. I wanted to bring up the paper because it's so amazing. I love that research. The paper that won Best Paper at CHI called Trigeminal-Based Temperature Illusions. Could you please tell us a bit about the project and how the idea for this paper emerged?
Yeah, I guess I'll explain the project first because it's kind of an odd one. If people are familiar with their sense of smell or flavor in general, they'll immediately know what this is kind of leveraging. So there's a bunch of research and just lived experiences demonstrating that we can trick the body into thinking there's a temperature sensation, right? For example, when you eat a chili pepper or when you inhale peppermint, right? These create kind of temperature sensation. That's why people say it's hot. Spiciness is heat, or peppermint has that refreshing sensation. It turns out that these compounds are binding to receptors that also respond to temperature sensations. So it's the same process essentially as going outside when it's negative 10 degrees Celsius in Chicago and breathing in the cold, crisp air. These receptors are responding to both the temperature changes and to the chemical stimuli that we're talking about in this case. And this paper really came out of a big question that my advisor and I had, which was when you're trying to produce temperature sensations via a computer, kind of like, let's say, virtual reality experiences and so forth, the traditional or most common way to do that is through something called a thermoelectric material or a Peltier element. It's this like thin material that essentially when you put electricity through it, one side gets hot and the other side gets cold. And to keep that temperature difference, that physical temperature difference, you need a lot of electrical power to actually do that.
Right.
And so the neat thing is that we were like, okay, how do we overcome this hurdle of like more efficient power drawing or making this completely wireless, right? Because VR headsets or most experiences like your phone or so forth, they're not tethered. You don't want huge cables coming out from the wall. And so the answer that we were just kind of exploring was tricking the body via this basic concept. And so in this case, really cool. We looked at it through the nose because you can use very small amounts of these compounds, like anyone that knows perfumery or flavoring ingredients might be aware of. You don't need a lot to go a long way.
Right.
And so you can just like release a small amount repeatedly over like a minute or two, and then it starts builds up that like temperature sensation that can spread for like the whole body for the most part. And that is that paper.
That's amazing. No, I love it. I love it so much. So what is your current area of research today?
So I kind of sit in an odd place. I think for most people, it'd be kind of weird what I'm going to say. In HCI, I call it like chemical interfaces because it makes more sense for the HCI crowd that's not very used to using these kinds of methods to interact with the human body, I would say. And in most part, it's basically just looking at different ways we can use, like do computer controlled like chemical delivery, whether that's like flavor ingredients or things that can change how you perceive other things, to then change how we interact with everyday life, whether that's smelling things, temperature experiences, eating, for example. And my research is very much like focused on like, okay, what can we do in this space? I think it's personally very ripe for new methods of input and output, as well as one area that I'm looking at is like more kind of like, I hope to collaborate on the medical side in the future, but we'll see. I'll put a pause on that one.
Very interesting. Yeah. So what then brings you to the smell-o-vision system? Like, what is your interest in smell-o-vision?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So outside of my doctoral research, I've been kind of focused on historical research as well, which has involved smell-o-vision and collaboration with Tammy Burnstock, Christy Spackman, and Lauryn Mannigel, who's actually in here. Hi, Lauryn. Sorry, I think someone's unmuted. But the basic idea is that I'm really curious about previous experiences related to smell for a couple of different reasons. I feel like oftentimes like scent media, like in scent media production, is almost reinventing the wheel oftentimes because we don't have like a sustained body of work that we can refer back to, whether that's actual like pieces that we can refer to and actually experience and so forth. And we're also oftentimes, I don't know if anyone else has like produced experiences or talked to like random people, but I think most people probably have the first reaction from people is going to be, oh, is that smell-o-vision? And so we are immediately cast into the context of what smell-o-vision is, why, what worked, what didn't work, and most people just associate it as a failure. And I would argue that, in fact, like even in the press or even in the public understanding of what smell-o-vision is, we don't know what that is. We just kind of have a term like, oh, smell-o-vision, the addition of smell to visual media, for example. But we don't know what the experience was. We don't know how it worked or what didn't work at all. And so it becomes kind of like this amorphous concept that we have to like wrestle with. And so I was really excited when I met Tammy, who was doing a documentary on this, and met Carmen Lauba, who's the owner of the device that I have behind me. Because I thought this was like the perfect opportunity to try and revive the device and see and like basically understand through practice what smell-o-vision was. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that's amazing. So who was the inventor and what can you tell us about the inventor of the system?
Yeah, so the inventor is, he's a Swiss inventor, originally produced a first version of what would be later called smell-o-vision in the late 1930s / early 1940s. At the time, if I remember right, he had previously worked with air conditioning systems. So this is kind of like an interesting trend for those. I think there's a couple of papers. There's a paper from Catherine Klepper. I'm trying to speak to academics and non-academics at the same time. For the academics, there's papers from Catherine Klepper, for example, that talks about kind of like the context of why smell kind of arose from people that produced air conditioning systems, which is really interesting from a cinematic point of view.
That's very interesting.
And I believe he paired with one of his, Robert Barth, if I remember right, one of his friends and a producer to create a kind of a demo reel is the way I would put it, a montage of different movie sequences or like video sequences, film sequences, there's no video at the time, like roast chicken, a race car track, and things like that with smell, and invited press to come see it in Switzerland. And
what year was this?
This must have been like, I want to say it's late 1930s, maybe 1936, 7.
Got it.
The response was good. So they were like, okay, time to make like a 40-minute film. And so they produced this film called My Dream. And this was in English. I finally figured out what the storyline is. I can give it to people that want afterwards. I found a book that's like this big. It's actually in French that talks about it. I've also been looking at news articles. And Switzerland decided to actually send this to the World's Fair, the 1941, if I remember right. And so it gets shown to the world at this point in the United States. Response was kind of mixed, I would say like overall quite positive. People were pretty fascinated by this experience. And then unfortunately, I think there was like patent claims or something. So the device or the film got seized by the US Customs after it was shown.
Wow.
Yep. And then Hans Laube would eventually go back to Switzerland in the end, and then keep working there. And then later on, I don't want to get into the whole thing. Sorry.
No worries.
I have a tendency of rambling. But yeah, that's Hans Laube. Very interesting character.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I didn't realize that it was at the World's Fair also. So that's really, really cool. So what is the smell-o-vision? Can you give us a tour?
Yeah, so I'm going to switch webcams. I brought this one specifically to actually put you into the device.
Amazing.
It's like experimental cinema at this point. And let me just remove the handle so I can actually hold this well. Great. So, can you guys see okay? I'm going to try and like.
Yes, we can. So what is this?
So, the smell-o-vision system that you see right here is probably an iteration before the final one used cinematically. It's basically so I'm going to try and like give an overview. It's a turntable with glass files, and you can actually see the count here. Basically, in groups of 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 8 of them, where the dot is the start one. There's 32 vials in this case that can each take 320 cc. And the way it works is that once there's a signal from the film strip, this will rotate the device to the right vial that it's looking for, essentially. And then it'll actually actuate here. I don't know if you can see this. Let me know if you can see the syringe.
Oh, yes. Okay, point at it.
So there's a syringe right over here. And when you can see it kind of go up and down. Let me see if I can get it closer.
Yep.
And basically, the syringe will come down and sample the odorized or the vapor inside of the glass bottle and inject it. It goes up here through a small tube into this area. And now the cool part over here.
Show the camera a little bit more so we can see that area.
So should I?
Yeah, there we go. That's perfect.
Yep. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll need some directing because it's hard to see my computer at the same time. Yeah, so once the syringe takes a little bit of the vaporized air and injects it into this compartment that's in the back that has holes on both sides. And this basically is like a chamber where pressurized air is going through.
Can you show us the holes?
Yep, I can actually show it on one side. Let me bring my computer a bit closer. Sorry, everybody. This is probably like gonna make you want to throw up or something.
No, it's perfect. Thank you.
So
okay.
You can see it goes straight through.
Yep.
And basically this area is going to be the outlet, the one that I'm showing right now. That would then have tubes that go all the way to the movie theater and then to each seat. And so let's see. And then down here, we can actually see the mechanism. I'm going to flip the camera. Let's see.
Okay, wow.
So this is like the full mechanism that's turning the device.
Got it.
On the underside and turning the turntable.
Very cool.
And
so
yes. Yeah, go ahead.
So they go, so the scents go into this chamber.
Yep.
And then there's tubes that go from here to every single seat in the movie theater. Is that correct?
Exactly. So the way it worked was that it had one, you could kind of imagine this as like a centralized odor source. And then they had like miles of tubing. And so Art Shea has these pictures that I can potentially share a bit later once I put the camera down that show people installing tubing in front of each seat. So it's not, it doesn't seem like the ports are close to the nose, but they're kind of in front of the seat approximately, like at ankle level or something of the sort.
Okay. So between each scent, there's air that's being shot through the chamber to clear it?
So that's the big question mark. And that's kind of an interesting one historically. And that's why I think this is really exciting to actually have one version of the device still around.
Right. So let's clarify that. So this is not the actual smell-o-vision. This is probably the one right before, right?
Yes, that's my best understanding and guess. So when you look at actual like pictures from Art Shea, who was the photographer for the Chicago premiere of the film, it shows Hans Laube in front of a slightly different version of the device. And in that version, it's using what seems to be metal cylinders. And you can actually distinguish each of the versions that were being used or prototypes. You can actually identify both this one and the final one in the patent documents.
Okay.
So that's what I've been kind of doing at the same time, is trying to place this one and understand what were the modifications since this one was produced in the patent documents afterwards.
So what did you learn? What are the differences, you think?
Yeah, so I think one of the big ones that's really interesting is the method by which odor is kind of kept in the patent version. So this one seems to be, you could put hypothetically like an oil, fragrance oil, or an alcohol-based perfume, or even solids inside of this one, and just sample the vaporized air. The final one seems to be the version of the patent that's described as having an inlet and an outlet. And so the way it was structured was, it's like these metal, these like aluminum bars. And on the inside, they actually coated the wall with a clay that was saturated with fragrance oil. And in that case, they were imagining that doing that assured even diffusion. Right. And they would have basically, instead of having like a syringe go down and sample, they would instead have like a pressurized air source that would push air from the bottom.
Oh, wow.
Upwards,
wow.
and essentially push the vaporized air into the chamber afterwards. Yep.
So where would this, two questions. How is this different from the Guggenheim experience, the Green Aria, which was also like a scented experience where you sit in a seat and you experience scents? And now I forgot the second question. So let's go with that one first.
I mean, if anyone's like produced olfactory experiences, I think the first thing that you realize is odor takes a while to travel from the diffused location to the actual nose that's like inhaling. And Christophe Damier did a fantastic job, I think, by designing like individualized devices, from what I understand in the documentation, that are very close to the nose. So it's like these craned devices that can be like brought very close. In contrast, the smell-o-vision has to basically surmount a hurdle or two. The first one that you can think of is basically, since all of the tubes are attached to one area, the amount of like air or pressure that comes to like all the outlets is not uniform, right? So some people might not have odor at the same time as everyone else.
I see.
And this is something that's like kind of reported. And this is like the experiment, right? When you do something at that scale, we're talking about theaters with almost 1,000 people seated.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Or like 600. No one really talks about that size. It's pretty intense.
That's very intense.
And then the other part is that the way it's installed from pictures in the Art Shea documentation is that there's still some distance between the outlets and the actual nose that's breathing in the odors.
Okay.
And the clever part, oh, Alex, if you want to show stuff, that's totally fine. Sorry, lab mate showing things to professors. So what's also neat about delivering things close to the nose is that you can have small quantities of things. So you might
Right.
not be worried that the air is going to be saturated as quickly with the odorants. And when you
Hence
do,
VR being
yeah,
a great
exactly.
application. Right.
VR is a great application, or you want to have essentially kind of like odor Walkmans, something that's like very to the individual attached.
Mm-hmm.
With smell-o-vision, you also have to account for the fact that when you're pumping out the odors, you have to assume that the air conditioning system can do filtration at the right speed and quantity to take out the odors that were already let out. And this is one of the cool things that Olivia and I were talking about that kind of comes up in Tammy's documentary, as well as newspaper articles from the time, which is they did actually some interesting tricks that I'm really curious about trying to reproduce with the system. I don't know if you want me to jump to that already, Olivia. Let me
Yeah,
know.
no, do it. Do it.
Okay.
That's perfect.
So what's really interesting is that if anyone knows about smell-o-vision, I think people always cite like Crowther's review in like the New York Times, if I remember right. And there's like a whole other discussion to be had about that. And I feel kind of weird just being a hand in people's videos. Let me just switch
Yeah,
to.
we'd love to see you.
Okay, that's a bit better. So what's interesting is that the reviews early on talk about the saturation of odor in the theater space.
Right.
And the odors kind of bleed together. And apparently in a later news article, or if I remember right, it was hinted that one of the producers realized that you can actually reverse the system. So instead of just like pumping odors out, you can also use it to kind of assist the air conditioning system by vacuuming odors back in afterwards, which is kind of an interesting concept.
So wait, so hold on. So you think that perhaps after the odors were released, they were then also used to, these tubes were also used to suck the odors back out of the theater?
I can't completely substantiate that because everyone's dead. That's the reality of the situation. We're kind of like losing these generations at this point.
Right.
We can experiment with that once we have the device up and running again. But from both descriptions, so Tammy interviewed two people that actually saw the experience when they were younger, of which one when they were 12 years old. And their descriptions suggest that there might have been something like that happening. And the way they described the experience was that the odors really did come in and out at the times that were necessary.
That's amazing.
So it's possible that they switched it. And I think everyone that's familiar also with olfactory devices might already be suspicious, right? Because if you switch the system, then all you're doing is pumping like all of the odorized air back into the room where all the odor sources are coming from. So you would kind of like maybe expect everything to commingle there and potentially saturate the tubes and whatnot.
Right.
It's possible that they did something to account for that. Like I'm not really sure. Maybe like having a switch or a valve that would then redirect the odorized air to the filtration system is one idea. But it's all speculation on that end. It's just intriguing to think about, like, can we actually reproduce that kind of setup and explore whether that was actually something that was done, or if it was actually getting issues with things suffusing together.
Right. I think what I thought was super interesting was that the first reviews were pretty negative, whereas further along, this aired for how long? Yes. Smell
Yeah,
like the scent of mystery.
I can get, for those that are interested, I've done this with the Aromorama currently, and it's a whole other subject as well, and I'm happy to talk to people about that in the future. But with the Aromorama, I've already done basically tracking how long it's been in the theater in New York and Los Angeles, and I'm planning to do the same thing with Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York for Scent of Mystery, which is the film that was produced with Smell-O-Vision. It was there for several months. Okay. So if you're imagining kind of like each theater can take between 600 to like 1,500 people, and they usually do like 3 showings a day, maybe 2, depending on weather, as well as like the holiday seasons, or if it's the weekend or the weekday. That's basically thousands of people hypothetically, and it was like a pretty good turnout.
Right.
And I think what you're kind of hinting at is that one of the things that was really interesting when I was both doing research on smell-o-vision and Roma, there's consumer reports actually about them. I usually think about consumer reports these days for like cars or things like that.
Right.
But at the time, consumer reports also included movie reviews and summarizations of movie reviews. And in 1960, you can find consumer reports for both Scent of Mystery and Smell-O-Vision and Behind the Great Wall and Aromarama. And it turns out that their summary for critic reviews was actually good to very good, which is quite surprising in contrast to like the one
What we
review.
hear about, yeah.
Exactly, which I think that's partially because everyone cites the same New York Times review over and over again. And that's like a whole other can of worms, right? We're trusting one person who was apparently a smoker also. That's like another like asterisk that I'm gonna add to that one. To basically become a critic of odor and deciding whether or not like the odors are correct, properly integrated and whatnot. And then the other part that's super interesting, and I'm still trying to figure out, I'm looking at like academic papers about like audience studies right now. And I can't do this during my doctoral time technically, but anyways, is that consumer reports include reviews from the consumers. And so at the time you could take like a leaflet and mail it back to consumer reports. And there's another one that I forgot the title of, but for anyone who's interested, I'm happy to just send you this stuff. Just email me.
So essentially these consumer reports were people who went to the movie and then they gave it a review. And from what you had mentioned before, the reviews were actually really good.
Yeah, they were good / very good as well. And
that's
this
really
is like,
amazing.
To give context, if I remember right, for example, like Behind the Great Wall with Aromarama, which is usually seen as like worse than even Smell-O-Vision, that one had an 85% consensus across critics and audiences that it was good / very good. And that was in the months that it was being played. Which is, I don't know, to me, that's kind of shocking.
It's pretty surprising. It's pretty surprising. So I wanted to just talk about the Scent of Mystery and how this was used, scent was used as part of the plot. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I love this. And this is like, for context, right? This is one of the first, I would claim, mass experiences written for smell, right? We're talking about, it's being released across several theaters, which could introduce its own problems, right? We don't know if they're all standardized or whatnot. All the theaters are different sizes, but it's quite a huge amount of people experiencing this, and it was written for smell. And so for people that are curious about Scent of Mystery, it's kind of like a comedy mystery where this English guy played by Denholm Elliott is convinced that this American heiress on vacation in Spain is in life-threatening danger. And there's like some interesting parallels between this movie and Hans Loeb's previous work, where the main character kind of like tries to save the heroine and chases after her through her titular fragrance, the Scent of Mystery. And you get some interesting use cases of smell where sometimes it's to give you, I'm trying to like tinge and not use too much academic wording. Like there's like olfactory gags. So you find out that someone slipped. Oh yeah, like jokes. Like someone slips on something and you have the smell of banana, if I remember right. So that like you realize it's the age-old joke of slipping on a banana peel. And then
That's funny.
A character is drinking coffee, supposedly, and then you start smelling rum or whiskey, if I remember right. And the main character is just like, what are you doing right now? It's in the middle of the day. Why are you drinking? Note that this is also the driver of the car in the whole movie, so like concerning.
Interesting.
And then the two that are super intriguing is that you can actually kind of glean information about the plot ahead of time if you're very sensitive to the odors. So one of them is that you can actually identify the villain through his tobacco scent, if I remember right. ahead of time, because he's never actually shown. But then you kind of like have a reveal, if I remember right, at the end. And then the other one that's really, really intriguing is that there's two heroines, in fact. There's an imposter, and then there's the actual like heiress. And the imposter has like a perfume odor that's supposed to be kind of like a cheap perfume. And then the heiress has like the actual titular fragrance, the scent of mystery, of which...
That's so cool. Of which Yaz actually sent me some. So let's take a smell of the scent of mystery that Liz Taylor wore in the film.
So yeah, I'll let you react. I've already smelled this a couple times.
Yeah, I mean, you can feel the rose, the white flowers in there. You can also feel that it's really old.
Yes.
So, so if anyone in the audience would be interested in helping us actually redevelop the scent that Liz Taylor wore for the movie, that would really be very, very cool. I think it would require some analysis and recomposing, but it's just so cool that this is the last remnant of odors that we found of the smell-o-vision and of the performance.
And I really have to shout out two people actually for these things. There's, for the odor, a fantastic story. Basically, the daughter of the producer, Mike Todd Jr., his daughter, Susan Todd, ended up finding on eBay the fragrance that was given out as a gift for the premiere of Scent of Mystery. And that gift fragrance was the titular Scent of Mystery. And so this is the last known sample of an odor from the film. Everything else that we know of right now is gone, including the original formulations, in part because they were produced by Alpine Aromatics and someone called Raul Pettinati, if I remember right. I might be saying his last name wrong. I'm sorry. But I could send you the news articles for those that are interested as well for that. And this titular fragrance, I think it in Avery Gilbert's book was attributed to Schiaparelli, more English pronunciation, I guess.
Yes.
In part, I think because Hollis Alpert claimed that it was a fragrance from that house, but I'm pretty sure it's actually from Raoul Pettinati, the Alpine Aromatics perfumer.
Interesting.
But yeah, it's really interesting that they offer this as a gift. Conceptually, this kind of aligns with Hans Laube's kind of like philosophy of odors. When he was presenting his early work in the late 1930s, newspaper articles were mentioning that he was pitching this almost as a method as well to advertise the fragrance industry. That's so that you would want to essentially wear the fragrance of the heroine or the hero to be like
the celebrity scent in the movie. That's so cool. So yes, I just wanted to ask a few more questions because we're gonna be running out of time.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No worries. What else did you find as in this box?
Oh yes. So this box was never opened for several years, and I have to give thanks to Carmen Laube, who's the daughter of the inventor. Super lucky story. She lives in the same building, actually the same apartment that her father did at the time. And one day the building calls her and says, "Hey, we found something in the basement. Do you want to take a look at it?" And she goes down and she sees this device and she's like, "Oh my God." And so she like pulls it into the elevator and leaves it in her apartment for years. And so this is the first time it ever left Manhattan in that building that we know of. And inside it was locked during that whole time. The keys were lost, so I had a fun time lock picking the front acrylic sheets. But we found 2 boxes inside as well. And let me grab them. I thought maybe it was like letters or something. I would say it's as interesting, if not more. We found these 2 boxes. And so it turns out
best air.
Best air.
Yeah.
So later in Hans Laube's career, he never let go of like fragrance as something that he was passionate about. In fact, after smell-o-vision was kind of derided publicly, or didn't have the success apparently that they were expecting, he turned towards home fragrancing technologies. And so if I open this, you have kind of like a home fragrance system. And I'll actually grab the other one because you'll actually be able to see the block on that one. My hands are going to get very dusty in this time.
No worries.
There. And then open. Here's the device. Like I'm doing like a modern unboxing video for a device from 60 years ago. So
how did this work, you think?
Great question. It basically had these containers. This looks very familiar to like commercial solutions for smell, right, these days. If you actually remove the plastic cap, it has like a block that was probably just dipped in fragrance oil, just like absorbed all of it. It still has a slight smell. And so you would have it kind of like go in. It has air holes on one side and then kind of like a grille on the front. And it's really hard to show this, but when you plug this in, because it does require some electricity, there's a bulb on the side that I'm pretty sure is just kind of like a heating element. So it's basically just like a passively diffusing block of fragrance, heating element on the side to kind of help it diffuse. And then I'm guessing that it was like installed like maybe in front of an air conditioning system or a window or things like that, so that like kind of a breeze would catch and kind of carry it into the room.
That's amazing. It's just so cool that this was already being done 60 years ago. My gosh.
That's been like the most fascinating part about this, is that along with the Aromarama research, it's really a product of its times in some sense, both the smell-o-vision and Aromarama. I've been like opening like those consumer reports, for example, and it's amazing to see. It's just like industrial testing of air conditioning systems was a thing. So you would like flip through pages and pages of like, what's the best air conditioner that you can get for your house? And it's kind of interesting that it comes at a time where like conditioning the air becomes such an important feature of the home, right? Because
interesting, yeah,
it's competing. This device was portrayed as competing with TV systems, right? They're trying to bring people back into the theater.
Wow.
And yeah, anyways, I'm rambling.
No. This is great. So over the last 25 years, we've seen a lot of technologies, smell technologies appear and disappear. Like I'm referring to like the DigiSense that came out in like 1999. So what do you think is different today?
This is the DigiSense mouse pad.
That's amazing. But yeah. So what do you think is different today? And what can we learn from all these experiments that have been done over the last 25 years and more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not entirely sure. It's kind of an interesting situation. I think that's why the historical aspect needs to be looked at more. Back at the time, for example, it was seen as like the perfect time to introduce smell into experiences. And then 10 years later, Charles Weiss, the inventor of Aromarama, comes back and says that 1975 or 1972, this is the perfect time for smell, because there was like the hippie movement and people started buying candles a lot, and American culture was going towards a direction of like experimenting with scent in their houses and things like that. And even then, he didn't come back. I think we're in a unique spot these days, and everyone here is probably going to agree with me. So it's not like I'm going to say something shocking. People are kind of much more open to the idea of olfactory experiences, especially after COVID has brought so much like attention to our sense of smell, whether that's through its loss or just through the fact that people were in their rooms and had to either share interpersonal experiences through like food over Zoom, or wanted to just go outside of their house and experience something new. And I don't know, I've just been seeing a lot of people responding to odor as a medium these days, a lot more than before. I can't say if this is the moment where everything's going to change because historically we've always thought it was the moment.
Right. But I think like in the work that you're doing by conserving and actually documenting all these things, we will not start from scratch, right? Because
Absolutely.
initially what people have been doing is starting from scratch every time. So it's really a new era, especially with your help. So I wanted to ask you then to tell us a little bit about like the artist in residency program you're putting together, and what is your goal with Smell-O-Vision today?
Yeah, so what I'm kind of hoping to do in the long run is, well, of course, the first step is either getting the device fully documented and either restoring it to a functional state, or if it's too invasive, open sourcing kind of like plans on how to essentially produce your own smell-o-vision system, and
That's
then
cool.
experimenting with it. And then what we've been talking about between Christy, Tammy, Lauren, and I is the possibility of funding like an artist residency, in part to see how people are kind of imagining smell media these days. And that could be recontextualizing the device outside of cinemas, right? It doesn't have to be in a cinematic context. But there's something about, like, I guess previously I talked about the bad of like the ambiguity of smell-o-vision, right? People don't know what that is. It's a
Right.
failure. They're not sure. But at the same time, like with this renewed interest in smell, there's an opportunity to explore that ambiguity of what smell-o-vision is in the opposite direction. Can people fill in and use their imagination as to what smell-o-vision could be in a
Right.
positive sense? Um, and that I think is really exciting.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
getting artists to start thinking about that, that's really interesting, to get their hands dirty and start really using and playing with the medium and technology, not just with the medium itself. So how do you think we in this room and beyond can support you in the best way?
Yeah, and sorry, I'm like pulling up the chat at the same time. Thank
Oh,
you. Thank you, Professor House. That's really helpful. And yeah, I've read those things and I've talked to Carl as well. It's really interesting work.
no, so we have David House here, Professor David House, an inspiration in smell anthropology. So I'm very honored that you're here. It's really, really incredible that you're here listening to us.
Can I just say, Jas and Olivia, thank you so much for your researches. I mean, the history of smell is a long one, but this is a chapter that has been oddly overlooked. And so by bringing it to the fore, you're filling in a crucial gap. I'd just like to refer you to the baby talkie, which is an invention from Japan, which was a kind of one of those spinorama things. You put it on a turntable so you could see an image while you were listening to a record. It
Oh,
kind of
wow.
lost its appeal because movies came on that
Right.
actually had sound, okay? But it was in the 1930s, so it's the same period. And there's all this experimentation with what you could call multimodal media going on then, you know, and we lived in such a monomodal or bimodal AV world for such a
Right.
long time. These experiments are really interesting. So, you know, thank you for this sleuthing, because that word sleuth, okay, it means having a good sense of smell. So you're the Sherlock Holmes of our olfactory history in sort of bringing this back. And again, thank you, Olivia, for organizing this, and thank you, Jas, for this research.
No,
Thank you.
thank you, David. Yeah, so like, how can we help you further?
Yeah, I think the first obvious one is that if you're interested in somehow like directly working with the device, let's say like you have electronics experience or experience with fragrance, for example, with the actual fragrance samples that we, the fragrance sample, there's no S, that we
Well,
have.
we got some interest from Man, big
Yeah,
fragrance company, French company. They said that they have 2 Man perfumers in the
thank you.
audience who are very excited to take on this challenge.
And I think other than that, it's just a question of like helping out. There's some parts that are costs just because we're trying to figure out what parts we have to replace potentially, or we're going to have to. I hope that we can restore it, but I'm scared that if it involves replacing anything drastically, we're likely just going to try and produce a double because it's actually made of wood. I was scared the first time because I thought it was like pure metal or things like that
Right.
for pictures, but it's wood, paint, metallic, which is good for me. But anyways, and then I guess one of the long-term things that we've talked about with Carmen, for example, is housing it, especially. So if you know any museums that might be interested, we're talking about like exhibitions as well. There's been work that I've been doing on Aromorama as well as DigiSense, and we're thinking about kind of like shows potentially. It could be smell-o-vision in particular, or housing it on the long term. So if you know any museums that might be interested in that, do let me know. It doesn't have to be a traditional museum. I think the big thing is just being able to show this and to talk about this. And I think part of this is also, I don't want to say it's like historical revisionism, because that's kind of like a negative thing on its own, but chatting about kind of like the complexity of smell-o-vision with other people, that I think that'll help with helping like a better like a public understanding of this device and the history of set media as well. Because most people just don't know what this is, right? They don't know what the experience is. So chat about it with other people.
That's great. Thank you so much for your work and for sharing.